Hello and welcome to my next lecture. Today we focus on the phenomenon of English as a lingua franca. The question that I pose today is, should we treat English as lingua franca, or maybe it's more lingua frankensteinia? I will try to discuss various implications for teaching English as a foreign language in Europe. There are basically two aims of our lecture today. The first objective is to show the factors to be considered while teaching English as lingua franca in Europe. Throughout my lecture, I will be using an abbreviation alpha. And number two, the second objective, it is showing some implications for teaching alpha in Europe. And let's have a brief look at the plan of the lecture. Well, first, I will discuss English as lingua franca and English as lingua franca in Europe. That is an equivalent of Euro English that we discussed some time ago when we've been talking about teaching pronunciation standards, different standards and shifting standards of teaching pronunciation. Then I will discuss the place of lingua franca, and I will try to answer the question, why is English a lingua franca? Why it is not Polish or German or other languages, but it is English? And then I will discuss the issue of English and its negative influence on other languages, what is called linguistic imperialism of the English language. And then I will discuss features of alpha, both phonological, right, and lexical features of alpha. And finally, something that is more practical, so I focus on implications for teachers. I guess that you notice that when you travel across different countries in Europe, you use English, but actually your English is not a typical RP English, British standard variety of English, right? Or it's not a typical general American, right? But it's a kind of English that might be called Euro English. I guess that we notice that when you are a tourist traveling to other European countries, you may communicate with various interlocutors. And even if you make some mistakes, lexical mistakes, grammar mistakes, or phonological mistakes, there is intelligibility between you and you as a tourist, right, and other interlocutors. If you have a look at the first cartoon, there is a question, can we make a picture with you? This is what I noticed. It's a typical mistake of Polish tourists quite abroad. And have a look at the reaction of the Spanish interlocutor. Of course, you may take it. Definitely there is a grammar mistake or lexical mistake, right? There is a problem with the selection of an appropriate vocabulary, because you know that in English we say, can we take a picture, right? But have a look. At the same time, the Polish tourist and the Spanish interlocutor, they were very successful in negotiation of the meaning. If you focus on the second cartoon, this is the gathering of the meeting of some businessmen. And have a look at the question. You have taken a report, isn't it? Of course, from grammatical point of view, the question tag, isn't it, is ungrammatical. But this is what happens. Nowadays, there is a phenomenon of a universal question tag. There is no haven't you, hasn't you, but there is isn't you, isn't it, sorry, isn't it, that is used for all the persons. So, what are these features, main features of this Euro English? Well, first, there is successful communication. And what may be noticed is that there is some common core that relates to some common features, grammatical, lexical, phonological features that ensure intelligibility between you, right, and other interlocutors from other European countries. And of course, number three, it must be admitted that the language that you use communicating with other speakers in Europe it has nothing to do actually with a standard British variety of English, right? It's not the English that you may find in soap operas or in various chat shows. So do not be surprised when native speakers of English, when they are actually listening to you talking to other Europeans, will say, well, what English do you speak? I don't understand you. All right, all that we've discussed, these are the main actually characteristics of Euro-English. This Euro-English is an equivalent of English that is used as lingua franca. ELF, right, is an abbreviation that I'll be using throughout my presentation. So, what are the main features of lingua franca? Have a look. Number one, it refers to communication between speakers with different first languages. Alright, so it does not refer to communication between native speaker of English and non-natives, right? Non-native speakers of English. Now, I guess that when we are talking about the phenomenon of English as lingua franca, we need to recognize the fact that roughly only 1 out of 4 users of English is actually a native speaker. What does it mean? It means that the majority of speakers of English are not native, right? And consequently, most EFL interactions are actually among native speakers and non-native speakers of English. So we may say that ELF is a kind of a contact language, because in a contact language, speakers do not share neither common native tongue nor national culture. When a Polish tourist tries to communicate with a Spanish speaker, definitely they do not share national culture, or they do not share any first language. ELF is part of general phenomenon. In the past, there was another actual abbreviation that was used. It was more popular than ELF nowadays. It was English as an international language, or World Englishes. But we may say that actually World Englishes or English as an international language is a wider term, right? So it actually encompasses ELF. Now let's focus on the place of English as lingua franca. A very interesting approach to the study of English was presented in 1992 by Kachru. He actually envisaged English as functioning in 3 circles. So we have an inner circle, right? In this inner circle, there are some kind of Englishes that are used by native speakers of English. So Americans, Australians, people in Great Britain, in New Zealand, right? And have a look at the score of this circle. 330 million of speakers are native speakers of English. What are the main features of this English? English that is used as a native language. Number one, it's multifunctional. It's transmitted through family, right? So it's generated at home. It's actually passed from one generation to another. Frequently, it's always maintained by government or quasi-government agencies, such as school or media. Of course, it's a language of dominant culture. And if you observe the proportion of these circles, you may see that English in this inner circle, the number of speakers using English as a native language, is actually minority in comparison to other speakers. But what is interesting about inner circle speakers, it is the fact that they actually claim to generate the norms, right? Norms that officially come from inner circle, but I guess that you know that actually frequently non-native speakers generate the rules. And when we compare it with the outer circle, all right, it's marked in this diagram with a blue color, right? this is what is described as ESL. So this is English functioning as a second language. This is the language that is spoken in Nigeria, for instance, in India, Singapore, to name just a few countries. And finally, we have expanding circle. So this is actually the focal point of our presentation today. In expanding circle, there are users of English who learn English which functions as lingua franca. And there are two abbreviations that are used: ELF, English as lingua franca, or ELFA, that stands for English as lingua franca in Europe. And this is actually our focal point. And what are the main features of English as lingua franca? Have a look. In comparison with English functioning as a native language, this is the language that is not transmitted through family. It's transmitted through schools. And it's user-generated. There is nothing that might be described right accent, or right grammar, or right lexis. Alright? So there is no equivalent of RP that functions, for instance, in the inner circle. And have a look, it's used to communicate. So the main objective is to communicate, of course, communicate between interlocutors representing different first languages. And it's modified language. So this is the language that actually we generate as speakers, and we modify it according to our needs, all right? And a question that is very disputable. Some researchers actually claim that it's the language that we use in this expanding circle satisfies the needs of the inner circle. Is it true? It's really hard to say. What we may observe studying these three circles, this is that there are the norms that come from the inner circle to outer and expanding circles. What are these norms? Most of the time, these are the norms related to pragmatic patterns. That is related to how written and spoken discourse is organized. Not so much it refers to pronunciation. I guess that you know that, and you notice that people coming from India, Nigeria or Singapore, they represent totally different pronunciation models, right? So pragmatic patterns are more actually influential and not so much grammar or pronunciation. And now let's focus on English functioning as a world language. I guess that you remember that I made a point at the very beginning that English as a world language is a wider term. But you may also find information, some literature, that English as a world language is a kind of equivalent of English as lingua franca. Well, personally, I'm just actually for the first point of view that English as a world language is a little bit different from English as lingua franca. So have a look at definition of English as a world language. It refers to the use of English that spans inner circle, outer circle, and expanding circle contexts. This is how I actually visualize it. So there are speakers in the inner circle, native speakers of English, right? And they use the language between interlocutors from outer circle and expanding circles. And have a look, expanding circle speakers may at the same time communicate with outer circle and inner circle speakers. And this is actually the slide that you saw some time ago when we've been talking about shifting standards in pronunciation. Once again, I think there is no point in discussing all these types of Englishes functioning in the world. I'll just take up some time and analyze different varieties of English. And now let's have a look at English functioning as lingua franca. I guess that you remember the previous model in which the use of English was spanning across these three circles. In English as lingua franca, there are the speakers who communicate by using English, but all of them are functioning in the expanding circle. So there are German speakers of English, Polish speakers of English, and, for instance, I don't know, Italian speakers of English. So English is chosen here as the means of communication among people from different L1 backgrounds across lingua-cultural boundaries. And English is a medium of intercultural communication. And now let's try to answer the question why it is English, a lingua franca, and it's not German, French or Polish. I guess that it's obvious for everyone that English is the most widely used language between people of different nationalities. And to have a look at some facts about the use of English. Billions are learning it at this stage. About 1/3 of world's population are in some sense exposed to it. And it is predicted that half of the world by 2050 will be more or less proficient in English. This information comes from Economist from 2001. And I found a very interesting title of an article that was published in 1989, so more than 20 years ago. And have a look at the title, The English Language, the Lingua Franca of International Science. So we may actually say that more than 20 years ago, English was anticipated to be this, language of future, right? The language that will have a dominant influence on science. And of course, it's related to expansion. Its expansion is related to processes of global Americanization, modernization, and Europeanization. And European Union economies, whether we like it or not, are integrated in some ways with American economies. The same actually is related to cultures. American cultures have a great impact on Europe. If you think about pop culture, Hollywood, right, movies, movie industry, it has a great impact on what is going on in Europe. No, so it does not take anyone by surprise that English actually substituted French. So some researchers actually put forward the idea that English should not be called a lingua franca, but it should be called lingua angla. That maybe it's a better term. But personally, I actually think that lingua franca is more, it's definitely a better term. It does not actually imply that, English might have any impact on linguistic imperialism. And now let's focus on the issue of the English language and linguistic imperialism. Philipson, in his article in 1992, he said, "My professional..." And now let's focus on the issue of the English language and linguistic imperialism. Philipson, in his article in 1992, he said, "My professional life started with training to be an English teacher in what I consider was a form of linguistic imperialism." Well, this quotation might be really, funny, but I think that it actually reflects what is going on in Europe. Definitely, English is this language that is wanted, right? When you have a look at any, adverbs, when you are looking for a job, right? The comment of English, good comment of English, is an absolute must nowadays, right? But a question that may be posed is, is really this expansion of English something so positive? Can we say that learning of English, right, and this expansion of English is really additive, meaning that it really has some positive effects, or maybe it's really subtractive, which means that it's negative, subtractive in a sense that it actually diminishes the role of other languages, native languages. And just think about, have a look at this picture. What's the difference between English only and white only? If you give some insight into this heading, I guess that you will agree that there is, very vague borderline between tolerance, right, imperialism, and on the other side, some good, positive effects of English. Okay, Philipson, in his article from Asian ELF Journal, he discusses various metaphors that may be used in reference to English function as lingua franca. All of these names, metaphors, are actually negative. They have negative connotation. The first one is lingua economica or economica, lingua americana. It refers to English functioning as the language of corporate neoliberalism and Americanization. What may be observed nowadays is that the language that is most frequently used in European companies, this is English. It replaced other languages. So we may observe that the role of native languages has been diminished. And another observation is that young people in Europe are consumerist, colonized, and are actually more familiar with American products and norms than those in European countries. And another metaphor of English that may be found in Philipson's work is lingua emotiva. It refers to the English language functioning in movie industry, pop culture, music industry. So what are the observations? 70 up to 80% of films on television and in cinemas in Europe are actually Hollywood products. And in America, foreign films represent only 1% of the market, which is indicative of the asymmetrical nature of cultural relations worldwide. I guess that if you pose a question about any Oscar award granted to any Poles, right? And if you put such a question to Americans, nobody would answer that, our famous director, Andrzej Wajda, was actually granted such a great award. But as it comes to American movies, Europeans actually know everything about them. And another name that is used is lingua cultura. It refers to English functioning as a subject at school, right? Subject in general education linked to the study of national cultures and literatures. So what may be observed nowadays in Europe, it is that English is the most widely learned foreign language. It is chosen by students more willingly than other languages such as French, German or Russian. So we may say that other languages that were popular some 2 or 3 decades are actually nowadays in retreat. And another metaphor of English functioning as lingua franca, that of course has some negative connotation, is lingua academica, which refers to English serving as a dominant language of publications, international conferences, and increasingly as a medium of content learning in secondary and higher education. I guess that you know this term, content learning. Content learning refers to teaching other subjects by means of English, right? Nowadays, there are many bilingual schools in which actually physics, mathematics, or other subjects are taught by means of English. So, research is increasingly published in English rather than in national or international scholarly papers. If I or my colleagues were at any international conferences and there are various sections that are in English, French or German, definitely these sections that are in English, that are full of participants, but there is no audience in these sections in which French or German functions as the means of communication. Have a look at the last hyphen. These are actually the facts. Ministry of Education allocates various points for our academic publications. And if we have a look at some papers, magazines that are national, such as Anglika Wratisławiensia, you may be allocated only 6 points. But if you manage to publish the same article in English, but in applied linguistics, you are allocated 32 points. Isn't it imperialism, linguistic imperialism? What do you think? And finally, some more names or metaphors, of course, having negative connotations that may be found across different literature. Lingua frankensteinia, or linguistic cannibalism, that was introduced in 1974 for the first time. It refers to this role of English that diminishes the role of other languages. And we may actually imagine the situation in which big language such as English gobbles up small languages. Or lingua tyrannosaura, that was introduced in 1996 by John Swales. Once again, it refers to subtractive, dominant role of English in various domains of our life, which consequently give rise to extinction of other languages, because everyone wants to shift to English. And killer language, or language murder, which refers to extinguishing minority languages, which is often a state policy with agents behind this policy being identifiable. Or linguistic genocide, that is a very, very tough word. Or lingua cocula, introduced by Salzhofer in 2006, in which English is treated as a kind of a cuckoo, right, in the European higher education nest of languages, and in which university policy rejects other languages. Well, if you give some insight to this problem, I guess that you would agree that as it comes to university policy, definitely it rejects, Italian, Spanish, or Russian language that used to be very popular in the past. Nowadays, the priority is English, and it is reflected in this university policy. But I guess that when we think about English, about all these positive effects, right, and about negative effects, I guess that we may come to a conclusion that benefits outweigh the drawbacks. Don't you think so? And now let's try to focus on some details. Let's try to describe this language, this kind of English that is described as English as lingua franca in Europe. There are actually two leading researchers that are dealing with alpha in Europe. The first one is Barbara Salzhofer, and number two, this is Jenkins. These two researchers that are actually working on alpha, but in different domains. They focus on different domains. Zeithofer focused more on grammar and lexis, while Jenkins focused more on phonetics and phonology. So let's start from Zeithofer. She's professor of English and applied linguistics at Vienna University, and she was appointed as a director for something that is called VOICE project. VOICE actually is an abbreviation that stands for Vienna Oxford International Corpus of English. What is this VOICE? This VOICE actually, this is the corpus of recordings of non-native speakers of English. It's actually the greatest corpus that is in Europe. And I'm not going to discuss in detail all her actually findings. Just to make the long story short, have a look at the main grammar and lexical features of alpha. So number one, dropping third person present tense, as. In other words, she observed that non-native speakers of English trying to communicate in Europe, right, between each other, right, they just do not use as in the third person. But once again, there is communication, successful communication. So, despite the fact that they drop actually this third person present tense as, they're able to communicate, and there is comprehension, right? There is intelligibility. And another feature is non-standard use of definite and indefinite articles. Articles are a nightmare, especially for Polish speakers of English, right? But once again, as you see, this is the main feature of alpha, and it allows Polish speakers of English to communicate successfully with other interlocutors. And using just the verb stem instead of gerund. Infinitive or gerund, if you think about all these grammatical aspects, definitely, if you think about passing some final exam, grammar is important. But if you think about it in the context of successful communication, well, the use of gerund and infinitive, it's not priority. And then using isn't it. Do you remember at our third or fourth slide, there was a bubble, right? Have you taken my report? Isn't it? All right. Isn't it is a universal tag. And what is really surprising is the fact that even native speakers of English, they started using isn't it as a universal tag. So I think it's a very interesting phenomenon, because it means that the norms are not just coming from the inner circle, but it might happen that there are some norms that are adopted by native speakers from non-native speakers of English. Now, people which. Have you noticed that if you make such a mistake, people which, instead of saying people who, that is intelligibility. And finally, have a look at some adverb that I found. A large luggage. You need a large car. This is actually an expression that comes from an advertisement. Luggage, from grammatical point of view, is uncountable. But here, we've got indefinite article. So all these features of alpha may be observed nowadays in the communication between Europeans. Okay, and now let's focus on phonological features of alpha. Jenkins has been studying lots of different corpora produced by non-native speakers of English, representing various L1 in Europe, and she was able to identify something that is called the lingua franca core. What is this lingua franca core? These are actually the features phonological features that have to be used by non-native speakers of English. That means that if you don't use them, there is no actually intelligibility. So have a look at her conclusions. Which sounds are crucial for intelligibility? TH pronunciation is not necessary for international intelligibility. So there is a tendency for Polish speakers of English to substitute TH with S or F, right? And once again, there is intelligibility. But have a look, aspiration, that many Polish speakers of English found not important, of sounds such as P, T and K, is necessary. Okay, so it means that if you do not employ aspiration in your pronunciation, it might give rise to some problems with intelligibility. And dark L, just like in the word hotel, is an absolute must. Now, consonants clusters. If I say I live in Spain, it's okay, alright, it's intelligible. But if I produce a cluster of consonants, product, some Polish speakers of English, they produce such a form, it's not okay. And vowels quantity, long versus short vowels, definitely it's important. So teachers should make the students sensitive to the difference between leave and live, peace, right, and peace. And finally, nuclear tonic stress. That is indicated not always, but frequently, but capital letters, such as, I come from France, where are you from? Okay, so once again, to make the long story short, these four features, they constitute the lingua franca core, which means that without these features, our communication will not be intelligible. So let's try to answer the questions of what are non-core features. Of course, other pronunciation features are designated non-core, so such as exact quality of vowel sounds, word stress, typical rhythm of British English, articles and prepositions, which are frequently pronounced so weakly that are hardly audible. But at the same time, have a look at a question. Have you noticed that teachers and learners, they spent a great deal of time and effort over practicing, especially the pronunciation, articulation of all the vowels and all the consonants, or imitation, perfect native-like imitation of British English? Alright, to make you understand, to make you feel what ELF is about, I prepared for you 3 or 4 slides representing different samples of English as lingua franca. Unfortunately, English as lingua franca not functioning in Europe, but in Asia. If you are interested in finding more examples, have a look at the website www.anguish.com, and you may find lots of funny texts. Have fun! Alright, so in the light of all these facts, I would dare to put forward hypothesis or thesis actually that the way that non-native speakers of English use the language must in some way change the way that English is taught. In this situation, we as foreign language teachers, we should reconsider traditional target models. These target models that, as you remember, come from the inner circle, right? From inner varieties that are imposed by native speakers of English. And maybe we as foreign language teachers, we should move toward pronunciation for international intelligibility using lingua franca core. So the question is, how should we teach English in the expanding circle? This is where we're functioning. Well, first, awareness should be created and cross-cultural communication strategies. Number two, we should develop a greater tolerance of differences. So, in other words, we cannot teach our learners that if you are exposed to non-native English and you don't understand it, you just turn back. Alright? So we should make our students exposed to varieties of different Englishes. Informing teachers about the varieties, collaboration with other teachers in all three circles. We as foreign language teachers, we will never be experts unless we are perfectly trained. We need to collaborate with our other teachers, and we need to communicate, right, by means of alpha, if we want to understand this phenomenon well and to talk about it with our students. What matters most seems to be the intelligibility of the uses of English in different countries or regions, not just in national boundaries. So that should be emphasized all the time. That if you are able to communicate with Polish speakers of English, it's not success. But if you are able to communicate with Italian, Spanish speakers of English, definitely you are successful. And this is partly related to what publishers should do. They should provide World Englishes and ELF perspectives in their books, materials. So we should not just focus as teachers of English on these materials that in which, RP English is presented, right? But we should use the variety of different materials in which Euro Englishes are presented. But the problem is that if we focus on Euro Englishes, what about testing? What about language testing and assessment? And to continue this line of thinking, I would like to pose a question. What English should be taught in the expanding circle? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on the expectations and the needs of your students. So, if we are teaching Polish students to use English in an educational institution, for instance in the USA, because we know that our students are going to, I don't know, they're going over to Great Britain or to the States to study, definitely the answer will be American English or British variety of English, right? But if our objective is to prepare our students to communicate in Europe, to communicate across different cultures, definitely in this situation, Euro English or English as lingua franca would be a better choice. And now let me give you a piece of my mind about English functioning as lingua franca in Europe. When I compare all the advantages and drawbacks of this phenomenon in Europe, the first thing that comes to my mind is, how should we really teach this language in a classroom? Does it really make sense to teach exclusively non-native forms? In other words, non-native norms. Can you imagine final matura exams either oral exams or written exams at which students produce non-native forms. And they may actually claim that these are the forms that are used by non-native speakers of English in expanding circle. Definitely, we need some norms. We need the norms that are from the inner circle in order to evaluate our students, for instance, at different types of exams. So I guess that the best idea is to introduce different samples of English as lingua franca to our students, to make them exposed to varieties of Englishes in Europe, but at the same time to demand on our students some kind of appropriateness coming from the inner circle. In other words, the norms, grammar norms, lexical norms, and pronunciation norms. Thank you very much for your attention.